In 1900, a single prairie dog town in Texas stretched 100 miles wide and 250 miles long. It contained an estimated 400 million animals. The colony was so vast that early settlers reported riding on horseback for days without ever leaving it. Today, that world is almost entirely gone. Across the Great Plains, prairie dog populations have collapsed by up to 98% of their historical numbers. The towns that once covered hundreds of millions of acres now cling to less than 5% of their original range. Small, scattered, fragmented islands in a sea of farmland. And for most of that century, the people doing the killing thought they were doing the right thing. This is the story of the animal. The United States government spent 100 years trying to erase, and what that decision quietly did to one of the largest ecosystems on the continent. To understand what prairie dogs actually are, you need to forget everything the name suggests. They are not dogs. They are rodents, stocky, barrel-shaped, roughly the size of a large squirrel, weighing between 1 and 3 pounds. They live in underground burrow systems across the short grass prairies of the American West, from southern Canada to northern Mexico. But here is the thing that matters. Prairie dogs are not just animals that happen to live on the Great Plains. They are the reason the Great Plains works at all. Ecologists call them a keystone species, a species whose influence on its ecosystem is so disproportionately large that if you remove it, the entire structure collapses. The same way, pull the keystone from an arch, and the whole thing falls. Approximately 170 other species depend directly on prairie dog colonies for food, shelter, or both. Eagles, hawks, burrowing owls, swift foxes, badgers, rattlesnakes, tiger salamanders, mountain plovers. And one species, the black-footed ferret, one of the most endangered mammals in North America, depends on prairie dogs for 90% of its entire diet. Without prairie dogs, the black-footed ferret simply cannot survive. But the dependency goes far deeper than a food chain, and this is the part that took scientists decades to fully understand. A prairie dog burrow is not just a hole in the ground. It is an engineering project. A single burrow system can run 6 feet deep and 30 feet long, with separate chambers for sleeping, raising young, and listening for predators. The entrance mounds are deliberately shaped and sized to control airflow, essentially a built-in ventilation system. A large colony might have thousands of burrow entrances spread across hundreds of acres, and all of that digging does something to the soil that nothing else on the plains replicates. Prairie dog burrows aerate the ground. They break up compacted earth and redistribute nutrients and organic matter from deep layers to the surface. They act like channels, pulling rainwater down into the soil instead of letting it run off. Peer-reviewed research has measured the difference directly. Grasslands with active prairie dog colonies show significantly higher rates of groundwater recharge, better soil stability, lower erosion risk, and higher carbon storage than identical grasslands without them. Their excavations, acre for acre, turn and fertilize the soil at a rate more than 8 times that of all other burrowing animals on the plains combined. And it does not stop there. Prairie dogs clip the tall grasses around their colonies short. What grows back in those clipped areas is a dense, low turf of nutritionally rich forbs and grasses, high in protein and nitrogen, that attracts bison, elk, and pronghorn from miles away. The great bison herds that once thundered across the plains deliberately sought out prairie dog towns to graze. The two species had a relationship that went back thousands of years. Prairie dogs kept the grass nutritious. Bison came to eat it. And bison grazing, in turn, kept the landscape open enough for prairie dogs to thrive. Take the prairie dogs out of that equation, and the whole system starts to unravel. The poisoning campaigns began in 1918. The United States government, responding to pressure from the livestock industry, launched a federally coordinated effort to eradicate prairie dogs from the western rangelands. The logic seemed straightforward. Prairie dogs eat grass, cattle eat grass, therefore prairie dogs compete with cattle and must be removed. That logic was wrong. Scientists would spend decades proving it wrong, but by the time the research caught up, the damage was already done. For decades, government workers spread poison bait across millions of acres of Great Plains. By the 1960s, when the campaigns finally began to slow, prairie dogs had been reduced to a fraction of their original population, and a new threat was already spreading through the survivors. Sylvatic plague, the same bacterial disease that causes bubonic plague in humans, arrived in North America from Asia in the early 1900s, carried by ships and rats. Prairie dogs have no natural immunity to it whatsoever. When plague enters a colony, it spreads through the flea population and kills with devastating speed. Mortality rates of 85 to 99% are typical. A colony that covered thousands of acres can be effectively wiped out in a single season. In the summer of 2017, plague swept through the Thunder Basin National Grassland in Wyoming. Within months, more than 90% of the prairie dogs in the area were dead. What happened next is the clearest proof science has ever documented of what prairie dogs actually do. Before the plague hit, Thunder Basin was a functioning grassland ecosystem. Ferruginous hawks hunted over the colonies. Swift foxes denned near the burrow systems. Mountain plovers, a bird that has declined by more than 80% since the 1960s, nested on the bare patches of earth that prairie dogs create. Raptors circled overhead. The year after the collapse, researchers returned to the same sites and surveyed what remained. Mountain plovers had virtually disappeared. The probability of occupancy for American badgers approached zero. Swift fox populations crashed. Ferruginous hawks were nearly gone from areas where they had been consistently present. The vegetation told the same story from the other direction. Without prairie dogs constantly clipping and disturbing the ground, the short grass structure of the colonies dissolved. Tall, dense grass grew in where bare earth had been. The habitat that dozens of species required simply ceased to exist. The researchers described it in their published findings as exactly what you would expect to see after the removal of a keystone species. Every connected layer of the ecosystem responded to the absence of one small rodent. And here's the thing that makes this story different from a simple conservation tragedy. The people who spent a century poisoning prairie dogs were not trying to damage the Great Plains. They were trying to protect their livelihoods. Ranchers watching their cattle on dry, marginal land genuinely believed that prairie dogs were taking food out of their herds' mouths. And in dry years, when grass is scarce, that competition is real. But the research that has accumulated over the past several decades tells a more complicated story. Grasslands with active prairie dog colonies consistently produce more usable forage than grasslands without them. The soil aeration and water retention that prairie dogs create increases overall plant productivity. The nutritious shortgrass patches they maintain attract wild grazers, but they also benefit domestic cattle grazing nearby. The same burrows that ranchers feared would break their cattle's legs were simultaneously recharging the groundwater their wells depended on. The problem was never really prairie dogs versus cattle. The problem was that nobody had yet done the science to show ranchers what removing the prairie dogs would actually cost them. And by the time that science existed, the prairie dog had already been reduced to less than 5% of its original range. The damage was already embedded in the landscape. Researchers studying areas where prairie dogs have been extirpated found something that connects this story to a much larger one. When prairie dogs disappear from an area, the soil compacts. Water runs off instead of soaking in. Groundwater recharge drops. Erosion increases. Woody shrubs, mesquite, and others begin to invade the open grassland because there is nothing left to clip them back and maintain the short grass structure. Over time, the land shifts from productive grassland to degraded scrubland. In some areas, to something closer to desert. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, the ecological catastrophe that turned millions of acres of Great Plains farmland into a wasteland of blowing soil and drove hundreds of thousands of families from their homes, was driven by a combination of drought, deep plowing agriculture, and decades of removing the natural systems that held the soil in place. Prairie dogs were part of those systems. Their burrows had been aerating and stabilizing that soil for thousands of years. By the time the drought came, much of that biological infrastructure was already gone. Nobody drew that connection at the time. Most people still haven't. The recovery efforts that are now underway are slow, complicated, and partial. Several indigenous nations, including the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, have made prairie dog restoration a central part of their land stewardship programs, partly because recovering prairie dog habitat is a prerequisite for recovering the bison herds that are also being brought back to reservation lands. The two animals are linked. You cannot fully restore one without the other. Conservationists are experimenting with plague vaccines, delivered through peanut butter-flavored bait pellets dropped across prairie dog habitat from the air. The goal is to give colonies enough immune protection to survive an outbreak, rather than being wiped out and having to slowly rebuild from scratch over years or decades. In some areas, prairie dogs are being physically relocated from conflict zones near cities and farms where they are considered nuisances to core conservation areas where they can establish new colonies safely. It is slow, labor-intensive work. Prairie dogs are territorial and sensitive to disturbance. Moving them is nothing like simply releasing them somewhere new and watching them settle in. And in much of their former range, the habitat itself no longer exists. Decades of farming, development, and soil degradation have transformed the land into something that prairie dog colonies cannot easily recolonize, even if the animals were there to do it. There is one data point from the research that is worth sitting with before this story ends. Scientists comparing grasslands with and without prairie dogs measured 5 specific ecosystem services: groundwater recharge, soil erosion control, soil productive potential, carbon storage, and forage availability. In every single category, the grasslands with prairie dogs won, not by a small margin, consistently, measurably, across multiple study sites. The animal that the United States government spent 100 years and millions of dollars trying to eradicate was the whole time doing more useful work per acre than almost anything else on the landscape. It was holding water in the soil during droughts. It was keeping the earth stable against erosion. It was maintaining the grass that cattle needed. It was building the underground architecture that 170 other species depended on to survive. And almost none of that was understood until it was mostly gone. There is a prairie dog town in Texas that settlers in the early 1900s described as the largest concentration of wild mammals ever recorded on Earth. 400 million animals, 25,000 square miles. That town is gone. The land it occupied is farmland now, flat, fenced, quiet. The science that would have explained what that colony was actually doing for the soil, the water, and the entire surrounding ecosystem did not exist yet when the poisoning began. The people who made those decisions did not know what they were removing. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Not villainy, not ignorance exactly, just the ordinary human tendency to see only what is immediately visible, the grass a prairie dog eats, and miss what is invisible, the water it saves, the soil it builds, the world it holds together underneath. The question now is whether enough of that world can be brought back before the knowledge of what was lost becomes purely historical. The prairie dogs that remain are still doing the work. In the colonies that survive, in the national grasslands, on tribal lands, in the scattered pockets of protected habitat across the West. The burrows are still aerating the soil. The clipped patches are still attracting bison. The ferrets are still hunting. The owls are still nesting underground. The system still knows what to do. It just needs enough space to do it.